In the summer of 1935, a bizarre story of mystic fraud hit the front pages across Los Angeles. The police had arrested 20-year-old John Dogan Wood for forging checks at a department store. When he was questioned, he told police that he'd been given instructions by none other than the dead silent film star, Rudolph Valentino. He claimed that the great lover was communicating with a woman named Marchen Jorgensen via a haunted typewriter in a house nestled high in the Hollywood Hills. Through these letters, Rudy would make specific commands for food, wine, and cash, things that every dead actor needs. Los Angeles wasn't a stranger to peculiar stories, especially not in the 1930s, but for a few weeks the public imagination was gripped by the tale of spirit-channeling swindlers and the spectre of one of the greatest stars of Hollywood's silent era. Then, like many of these stories do, it disappeared and was eventually forgotten. That was until I stumbled upon it while I was browsing newspaper archives, and I obviously had to make a video about it. 1930s, a mystic cult channeling a silent film star? Fraud? As soon as I saw it, it was ticking all of the boxes. So let's take a journey into 1930s Hollywood and delve deep into the cult that channeled Rudolph Valentino. This video is brought to you by viewer support on Patreon. You can join for £3 a month, which will give you early access to videos and access to our Discord server. On other tiers, you get access to Patreon-only podcasts and videos. So what are you waiting for? Find the link in the description and sign up today. It was August 15th, 1926, when beloved silent film star Rudolph Valentino collapsed at the Hotel Ambassador in New York. He was quickly hospitalized and diagnosed with appendicitis and gastric ulcers. The press reported that he was in a grave condition, and unsurprisingly, a throng of female fans flocked to his bedside. There were reports that he was rallying, that he was suddenly getting better, and on the day he died, it was reported that he sat and spoke with his doctors about his future. But sadly, his future was non-existent. He died on the 23rd of August 1926 at the age of 31. Valentino's body was moved to the Frank Campbell Funeral Home, and they wasted little time before capitalizing on their famous deceased client.
Thousands of movie fans jammed the streets around Campbell's funeral parlor in New York as Rudolph Valentino lies in state.
Frank Campbell himself was described in a New York Post article as the P.T. Barnum of death, which is one hell of a nickname. He had actually revolutionized the funeral industry by introducing the first funeral parlor chapels, as well as actually advertising his business in newspapers. And he was definitely fond of a publicity stunt. While the outpouring of grief that followed Valentino's death was organic for the most part, there's no doubt that Campbell encouraged it, and some claim that he even paid women to swoon and faint so that the newspapers would pick that up and give him more publicity. Bizarrely, the funeral home also hired 2 actors to pose as members of Mussolini's fascist black shirts. They stood guard over his coffin and placed a wreath that was supposedly from Mussolini himself. The thing is, Frank didn't really need to do any of that. People flocked to the funeral home in droves.
30,000 mourners showed up on the very first day to try to see his body in Campbell's funeral home. Then it started raining and a riot broke out. The police were called in, people were injured, and it was quite an incredible scene. And as unbelievable as this may sound, there were at least 2 reported suicides that were spurred on by grief over Valentino's death. There was one woman who shot herself while clutching a sheath of Valentino photos, and another woman in London who took poison and left a suicide note surrounded by Valentino's photos. And the note read, "With his death, my last bit of courage has flown."
In 1927, just a year after the death of the world's most famous silent film star, the first ever feature film to use synchronized dialogue was released. It was called The Jazz Singer.
Nothing but blue skies It was a shock, absolute shock to hear this man open his mouth and a song come out of it.
Nothing but little bluebird all day long.
It was one of those once-in-a-lifetime experiences, but you see that happen on the screen, a vision, a shadow can come out, a voice can come out of that shadow.
And there was a line the whole way around the block all day long. They started the show at about 9 a.m., I think, and the lines were forming practically at dawn.
The era of silent films was over, and it seemed that a new day was dawning in Hollywood. This new marvel of synchronized sound meant that thousands of musicians that had worked in theatres across the land suddenly found themselves out of work.
Musicians who once accompanied films like this were now no longer needed. A whole industry had disappeared.
It was a great industry at that time, and it just collapsed.
Of 22,000 theater musicians in the United States, half were immediately thrown out of work.
All those wonderful orchestras, all the wonderful men, concert masters, people they had imported from Europe, great orchestras, they just left them stranded.
By 1932, only 4,000 were left.
There were suicides, sadly to say, galore.
By all accounts, Marion Jorgenson was a talented young pianist. She was born on the 18th of March 1914 in Copenhagen, Denmark, to Olof Johan Jorgensen and Karen Bakker. The family arrived in New York on the 25th of March 1921, and from what I could ascertain from records on Ancestry, they initially lived in Massachusetts before moving to California in 1926. They became naturalized citizens in 1928. At the age of 16, Marion was studying under Adele Dorothy Louth, a well-respected piano teacher in Los Angeles, whose extensive concert tours had taken her over Europe and Asia. According to one newspaper article, Marion was one of her advanced pupils, so it's safe to assume that she was pretty good. It's important to note that Marion was entering the world of entertainment at a tumultuous time. She was training as a pianist in the era of transition from silent films to talkies, and as a young woman she was looking for work in Hollywood during the Great Depression. Now, a quick Google search will tell you that Hollywood weathered the storm of the Depression by providing people with a cheap form of entertainment in trying times. You'll probably find the famous FDR quote about Shirley Temple too.
When the spirit of the people is lower than at any other time during this depression, it is a splendid thing that for just 15 cents, an American can go to the movie and look at the smiling face of a baby and forget his troubles.
While that may be true, it was also a period of intense struggle between workers and the big studio moguls who exploited them. In his book, Ink-Stained Hollywood, Eric Hoyt writes,
"The March 1933 bank holiday proved a pivotal moment in Hollywood history, particularly in the relationship between studios and their creative workers. In response to the bank holiday, the studios implemented 50% salary cuts to most of their production workers."
The brutal cuts in wages led to the creation of the Screenwriters Guild and the Screen Actors Guild in 1933. And while this era was heralded as the golden age of Hollywood, it was by no means an easy living for studio workers. While I can't find any specific films that Marion starred in, she was described as an actress in the press. I've got no doubt that she probably appeared in movies as an extra and was probably never credited, but I guess I'll never know for sure. 1934 was somewhat of a dramatic year for the then 20-year-old Marion. On the 4th of May, she was allegedly found unconscious on the ground on Lookout Mountain Avenue in the early hours of the morning. She had a bruise on her head, and the man that found her attempted attempted to revive her. When it didn't work, he took her to a hospital in Hollywood. It was there that she claimed that she had been walking in Laurel Canyon when she'd been shoved into the back of a car. She had no idea who these kidnappers were and couldn't remember much of what had happened to her. She hit the headlines again on the 1st of September 1934 when it was reported that she had sued actor's agent and performer Lou Bryce for $100,000. Now, Lou's sister Fanny was much more well known than he was.
Don't tell me not to live, just sit and putter. Life's candy and the sun's a ball of butter.
Although Lou did have a short-lived marriage to the actress Mae Clarke. I want to add that Lou Bryce took great pleasure in telling the press how much he enjoyed watching the scenes of his ex-wife Mae Clarke being beaten by James Cagney in movies like The Public Enemy and Lady Killer. He also broke a woman's nose in 1938, so that gives you a bit of an idea about the kind of man that Lou Bryce was. According to Marchen, on the 27th of December 1933, she had arrived at Lou's room in a Hollywood hotel to ask him to obtain a motion picture contract for her. So, in other words, she was looking for work. She found him under the influence of liquor, and she was quoted as saying, "I expected to find a gentleman, but I found instead an intoxicated man. It was Mr. Bryce. He invited me into his bedroom to see some pictures." It was there that Marchen alleged that he attacked her. Lou Bryce claimed that Marchen had actually visited him to ask for his help in getting her a fake work contract in an attempt to get her fiancé past immigration officials at the Mexican border. When the case went to trial, Marchen claimed that she had been under the care of physicians for months after the attack and that she had lost 20 pounds. Her testimony was corroborated by her roommate, a dancer named Corinne Williams. The press at the time seemed to downplay the attack as just a kiss in inverted commas, despite the fact that Marchen had claimed physical injury and had testified that the attack was much more than a kiss. The jury ultimately ruled in Marchen's favour, although in the end she was only awarded $1,000 instead of the $100,000 that she asked for. Part of me does wonder whether Marchen's abduction in May 1934 had anything to do with Lou Bryce, but I doubt that we will ever know. For the record, I absolutely believe Marchen's account, and the fact that the press reported this as an unwanted kiss just speaks volumes about how women were and still are treated in industries like Hollywood. It reminds me of people like Harvey Weinstein, who got away with assaulting women for years, and even after his conviction, he still has people defending him, which is just wonderful. Now, Lou Bryce will make another appearance towards the end of this strange saga, so stay tuned. But for now, let's talk about the cult. At some point in 1935, Marchen had met 20-year-old John Dogan Wood at a party. The newspapers reported that he was the son of a Pasadena society matron and was due to inherit a large estate the following year. At the time, Marchen was living in a home high in the Hollywood Hills. The address was 3206 Deronda Drive, and although these photographs are from a few years ago when the house was on the market, it gives you a sense of just how opulent it was. It also recently sold for nearly $4 million, which is absolutely insane. I'm sorry, every time I think about just how expensive it is to have the luxury of a roof over your head, I get so angry and baffled at the state of the world. I mean, it's a nice house, but $4 million? $4 million, and you could literally have a forest fire come and wipe out your entire property and all of your life, and then you'd call up the insurance company and they'd say you're not covered. Sorry, I'm going on a rant. Anyway, back to the story. Marchen claimed that she soon allowed John to stay in the house as he had nowhere else to sleep. From what I can ascertain, she lived there with at least two other men, the Austrian actor Rudolph Steinbock and the art director William Tuntke. John was enamoured with Marchen from the get-go, and who can blame him? She was strikingly beautiful and talented, courted, so it wasn't long before he proposed to her, but sadly their romance was to be short-lived. Towards the end of May 1935, John Dogan Wood was arrested on suspicion of forging at least $65 worth of checks in downtown Los Angeles department stores. At first, it seemed like a fairly standard petty crime, but when he was questioned by the police, John told an incredibly bizarre story.
You know, there are some things in life that cannot be perceived by the mind, because they're meant to be understood with the heart.
The early 20th century was a melting pot of metaphysical ideas and new religious movements, from Rosicrucians to Theosophists, fortune tellers and astrologers, seances, palm readers, crystal balls, tarot cards and Ouija boards. There was something for everyone, and Hollywood seemed to embrace it all with open arms. An article from May 1929 declared that mystics rule Hollywood, and that performers believed more fervidly than ever in their power. Indeed, it seemed that plenty of Hollywood stars believed in the occult. Mae West was reported to never take a major step without consulting her occult counselor. Joan Crawford supposedly kept a dictaphone running by her bed to record messages from the astral world. And Valentino's ex-wife, Natasha Rambova, believed that she was in close communication with her former husband in the spirit world. Natasha was no stranger to metaphysical and occult beliefs. Her mother was a theosophist, and in later life, Natasha would become friends with Manly P. Hall and various other famous occultists. While married to Valentino, she alleged that he was a spiritualist and a gifted psychic himself, and that he had engaged in the practice of automatic writing. In the late 1920s, she had begun a friendship with George B. Weiner, a musician and medium from the American Society for Psychical Research. The two of them had grown so close that she had invited him to holiday with her and her family on the French Riviera. It was here that George allegedly prophesied Valentino's death just a few days before he actually died. Now, on paper, it looks like he appeared to have gotten this prediction right, but it's important to note that he made the prediction after Natasha had received a message informing her that Rudy had been taken ill. George supposedly channeled the spirit of Valentino's mother, who said,
"He is lying ill in New York, but he will not recover. In a very few days he will pass out of the body, as you call it. He will die. His time on earth is done. I have come to be near him at the moment of death. I am glad that I passed on first, for now I can help him in the hour of need. As I gave him to the earth in birth, so now in rebirth I can give him to life eternal. He will go on Monday. On that day, he will come to me."
Natasha seemed to put her faith in George, and it was through him that she began communicating with Valentino on the astral plane. They conducted multiple seances together that Natasha later wrote about. But by 1935, it wasn't just Natasha claiming to be in contact with old Rudy. Now, I've got no idea what the police must have thought when they questioned John Dogan Wood, and he told them that the reason that he'd been cashing worthless checks was because the spirit of Rudolph Valentino had told him to. According to him, at Marchen's Hollywood home, a large oil painting of Valentino had been hung on a wall that overlooked a typewriter. A hole had been made in the mouth of the painting, supposedly allowing him to speak directly to Marchen. John also claimed that underneath the portrait were 2 pots of incense, which had to be kept burning at all times. That was very important. No incense equals no messages from Rudy. The group at the house had also made sure to adorn the surrounding area with flowers, perhaps to make it aesthetically pleasing enough that Valentino would deign to speak with them. As for how the messages were received, John and Marchen both gave conflicting accounts. At one point, John said,
"I could hear the typewriter clicking late at night. and in the morning there would be a message telling me to cash a check. No one was supposed to have written on the typewriter.
But then he gave another account where he claimed to actually see the messages come through himself.
I had faith in Marchen, and I used to watch over her shoulder while the messages would come in on the typewriter.
Was it like a Ouija board?
Yes, only it gave out more explicit messages and instructions just for me. I couldn't get these messages myself. They would always come through Marchen.
She later told the police that she would go into a trance and sit in front of the typewriter. It was there that she received psychic messages. What she was describing was indeed automatic writing, the very practice that Natasha Rambova claimed that Valentino himself was capable of. It was somewhat of a popular practice in the early 20th century, and Marchen wasn't alone in using the act to talk to dead famous people. The spiritualist Pierre Keeler famously claimed to channel the spirit of Abraham Lincoln and wrote messages from him on a slate that is currently held at the Lilydale Museum. As for Valentino's messages, John claimed that the entire household would receive them via the typewriter, but the ones directed at him seemed to always be concerned with earthly matters such as acquiring household goods and food. Some of the messages included specific instructions.
Get large chicken, turkey or lamb roast. Very large though. 1 gallon of wine and 3 bottles of sparkling water.
Now to me, this immediately made me think of Amy Carlson or Mother God from the Love Has Won cult. Rest in peace. Kinda like Marchen, Amy claimed direct communication with various celebrities like John Lennon, Robin Williams and Patrick Swayze, to name but a few. And she always seemed to be preoccupied with ordering food.
My vision was chicken parmesan. So the fucking Adams turn around on me and get me meatballs. I didn't say meatballs. I love meatballs. But I didn't fucking say that. Holy shit, FX. Chicken parmesan.
Can you imagine if YouTube was a thing back in 1935? We might have over 2,000 hours of live streamed communication with the spirit of Rudolph Valentino. In total, John received 12 messages that instructed him to purchase mundane things to keep the house running. Now, if that was me, I would feel a bit gutted. I mean, while the rest of my friends in the house are getting these really nice messages from one of the most famous silent film actors ever, all he's got for me is a bloody shopping list. I'd be having none of it. Actually, I'd be having words with him. I'd be like, Rudy, what's going on? Why are you sending me messages about getting a large turkey and sparkling water? Also, if you're dead, why do you need that? There's too many holes in the story. But I guess it could make sense if Rudolph Valentino had the demeanour of one of Casper's uncles from the 1995 movie.
You need my
The way that John told the story, he was the financial support of the house, and he believed that these messages channeled through Marchen were real.
I believed the messages I got through her, and I used all the money I had supporting that house. I must have spent $200 or $300.
Now that was a claim that Marchen later disputed. We let him live in our house because he had no place to sleep. We kept him 9 weeks and he didn't pay a cent. He did buy some groceries on his aunt's account. There was never any message directing him to buy these things. So after John was arrested and told the police that he was being guided by the spirit of Valentino channeled through Marchen Jorgensen, the police began to suspect that they had a cult on their hands. I've quoted from it before on this channel, but there's a great article by Philip Jenkins called The Great Anti-Cult Scare of 1935 to 1945, and it really helps to contextualize this strange era of American history.
Small religious movements were likely to attract intense suspicion, especially if their members were separated from the public in remote compounds, or if there was any suspicion that leaders were using the operations as rackets to fleece unwitting believers. These allegations became intense from the end of the 1920s as the New Age ideas, hitherto concentrated on the Pacific West, were projected onto the national stage by mass marketing techniques, as new movements brought the word of mystic revelation to millions.
Now, with that in mind, it's not altogether surprising that the police quickly turned their attention to the home in the Hollywood Hills, where Marchen was supposedly directing her so-called cult. On the 30th of May, the police raided the home. They took the haunted typewriter away for inspection and arrested Marchen and 3 others, Rudolph Steinbock, William Schultz, and Ralph Lindau. I did find one newspaper report that claimed that William Tuntke was arrested as well, but I couldn't corroborate it. And when I was looking through the newspaper reports, I saw that William Schultz was also referred to as Rudolph Schultz, and at least one newspaper report claimed that he had given that name to the police. Now, bear in mind that Steinbock's first name was actually Rudolph. So then you've got these 2 guys who both say that their name is Rudolph, and the report is that this woman, Marchen, can actually channel Rudolph Valentino. It really did help to make the whole thing sound more cult-like they'd all just adopted the name Rudolph for themselves. But in the spirit of full disclosure, I am going off newspaper reports that are 90 years old. The facts may not be 100%. We all know how the press can be. They were all arrested on allegations of running a bunco ring, which is an old-timey way of saying that they were scammers and swindlers. While the 3 men arrested at the home were released on the same day, Marchen and John were kept overnight at the Lincoln Heights jail. The next morning, all 5 of them appeared at the district attorney's office to see whether or not charges would be filed against them. It was here that Detective Lieutenant Miller posed with the haunted typewriter for a photograph, supposedly checking it for Valentino's ghost or God knows what. Also pictured was Marchen next to her one-time lover John, with the haunting portrait of Valentino as the sheikh looming behind them. Steinbock and Schultz ended up being released when the DA failed to provide any evidence of fraud against them, but John and Marchen spent another night in the clink. The next day, they were both charged with 6 counts of forging sales slips at a downtown department store. The police had evidence that John had gotten hold of his wealthy aunt's checkbook and had begun forging the name of his uncle, John David, to charge the account with groceries and household goods, as so ordered by Valentino. Obviously, the police had no evidence for the Valentino part, but that doesn't really matter. Marchen and John were released on a $500 bail pending the preliminary hearing on June 7th. The papers wrote that the 2 nights they'd spent in jail had cooled the romance between them. Up until that point, John had been wearing a necklace that Marchen had given him and was adamant that they would be married. But he was starting to see that perhaps none of it would come to fruition.
This has been a lesson to me. I really loved Miss Jorgensen, and she gave me to understand that she loved me.
It was the 7th of June when the case finally reached a less than dramatic conclusion. The Deputy District Attorney, John Barnes, had discovered that John Dogan Wood had once spent time in a mental asylum and had been pronounced mentally incompetent. It was this, combined with the department store where he had attempted to cash the fraudulent checks, asking for the case to be dropped themselves, that led to the dismissal of all charges. Marchen and John were free to go, and that was it. That seemed to be the last that anyone heard of the so-called Hollywood cult that channeled Rudolph Valentino. On the 2nd of September 1935, Marchen's name hit the newspapers again. This time, she'd been reported missing by William Tuntke, who had lived with her in the Valentino cult house on Deronda Drive. He claimed that at that time she was living at 2921 Francis Street in MacArthur Park, and that after a visit to her previous home, she had announced that she was going to downtown Los Angeles. He said that that she had $250 in her possession and that she had left her personal effects behind. She hadn't been seen since. 6 days later, another report appeared, this time quoting 2 police detectives who, after interviewing Marchen's friends and associates, believed that she was travelling incognito to Denmark. Now, I've got no idea how the detectives came up with that story, because the next day it was reported that she had wired her friends from Galveston, Texas, and told them that she was heading to the East Coast. I mean, that's a far cry from Denmark. Then, 4 days after that, the newspapers reported that the missing Hollywood musician was in New York and was almost penniless. She had sent a postcard to one of her friends back in LA, telling them that she was in dire straits. They eventually offered to pay her fare back to California. I have to assume that she got there because just over a year later, in January 1937, she landed a role as a ballet dancer in a production at the Hollywood Playhouse. It was called Review of Reviews, and it was described as a musical satire of current events. In 1938, Marchen gained a supporting role in another bizarre story that the tabloid press could not get enough of. Now, to refresh your memory, it was 1934 when Marchen sued Lou Bryce for assault and won. The court demanded that he pay her $1,000 in damages, but he never did, and for years Marchen went without the money. Flash forward to 1938 and Lou Bryce's name was all over the headlines. He had gotten himself embroiled in a poker dispute with a British aristocrat named Henry Talbot de Vere Clifton. Now, Henry was incredibly posh, like we're talking landed gentry, and some even claim that he was the inspiration behind the character Sebastian Flyet in Evelyn Waugh's novel Brideshead Revisited. Henry inherited thousands of acres of land, and when he inherited it, he ended up selling off quite a large chunk. Now, he used that money to buy expensive nonsense, travel around and hang out with occultists and gamble, as you do. Lou Bryce was a big poker player, and he'd first met Henry a few years back. They'd played a friendly game, and Henry had ended up losing $10,000 to him. Now, this shows just how much money Henry had, because back in the mid-1930s, that was the equivalent of around $230,000. Absolute insanity, and it only gets worse. Bryce got in contact with Henry again in May 1938 and asked him if he wanted to sit in on a game, to which Henry accepted. The newspapers gave a detailed account of what happened next.
At dealer's choice, he lost peanuts, just $1,000. Then the game was changed to stud, first with a 50-cent limit, which was later removed. Presently, the Britisher was dealt kings, back to back. 2 of his next 3 cards were jacks, which he paid $50,000 to draw. 3 players dropped out. Bryce, with 5 cards, had 2 sevens showing. Clifton bet $100,080 on his 2 big pair. Bryce called, showed his 3rd 7, and raked in the pot, which contained some cash, Bryce's IOUs, and Clifton's 2 checks, one for $100,000 on a London bank account and the other for $50,000 on a New York one.
In short, Henry lost big time to Bryce's 3 of a kind, but losing at poker wasn't anything new, and it seemed like Henry just didn't know when to hold 'em and when to fold 'em. That would have been the end of the story if it hadn't been for a lavender-haired occultist named Violet Greener, also known as the Ghost of Hollywood. In 1932, she opened the Agabed Occult Temple, supposedly named after her mother, Mary Agabed, and in at least one photograph I found of her, she bore a striking resemblance to Edna Ballard from the I Am cult. I mean, seriously, it's uncanny. Her name, Violet Greener, may have come from the fact that she dyed her hair purple and wore striking green eyeshadow.
I accentuate that in my services. The people like a good show, so I give them one. The lighting above me throws off the lavender shade of my hair. The green eyelids are makeup. I wear gorgeous clothes, hang myself with beautiful beautiful jewelry, they like it.
Her and Henry Clifton were very close friends, and he had even gifted her a diamond gardenia, which was said to be valued at around £2,000, as well as an emerald ring that allowed Violet to know whenever Henry was in trouble. Some reports claimed that it was the ring that let Violet know that Henry had been swindled in a poker game, but other retellings of the story claim that it was Henry that had told her about losing the game. Either way, Violet quickly told him that none of the men that Henry had been gambling with actually had any money. Remember, during the game, Bryce was putting IOUs into the pot instead of cash. Henry paid a visit to the district attorney's office, and he took out a court order and stopped all payments to Lou Bryce on the grounds that Bryce had tricked him and misrepresented his ability to pay if he lost the game. When the investigation began, there was a dispute over whether they were playing stud or draw poker. Stud poker just so happened to be illegal, whereas draw poker was perfectly above board. Now, obviously, Clifton, trying to save his money, claimed that the game was stud, whereas Bryce claimed that it was draw. The story hit the front pages, and I can only imagine Marchen picking up the newspaper and seeing that Lou Bryce had won $150,000 while he still hadn't paid her a bloody penny. So naturally, she decided to file for a writ of garnishment, which is a process by which the court orders the seizure or attachment of the property of a defendant or judgment debtor in the possession or control of a third party. To put it simply, she wanted her money and she wanted it now. The only problem was, just as the police were digging into the case, and just as Marchen had filed for the writ, Lou Bryce suddenly agreed to waive all rights to the money. Just like that, he gave up $150,000, which in today's money is more like $3.3 million. Some people speculated that he was fearful that the police would deem the game illegal and that he'd possibly face jail time. Whatever the reason, Lou never got his money, and I'm unsure if Marchen ever got hers. In 1948, Marchen married Richard Mann, and together they had at least one child. The marriage was short-lived, and they divorced in 1951. And although I couldn't find the marriage certificate, I'm fairly certain that Marchen ended up marrying her former roommate, friend, and fellow member of the Valentino cult, William H. Tunkey. He was actually nominated for 2 Academy Awards for art direction, the first for Mary Poppins in 1964, and the second for the Andromeda Strain in 1971. He was also the art director for various episodes of Kojak, Murder, She Wrote, The Sixth Sense, and Kolchak the Night Stalker. He sadly passed away on August 25th, 1997. Marchen followed him 6 days later, on August 31st. Now, I use the words Valentino cult in inverted commas because I don't think they were really a cult. And I know what you're thinking, and I know what someone's going to say in the comments. If they're not a cult, then why did you put it in the title? And my only answer is that the Hollywood cult that channeled Rudolph Valentino is a better title than the group of Hollywood studio workers that may have believed in channeling but were quite possibly just scamming a young man out of money so that they could eat nice groceries. It doesn't really have the same ring to it, does it? I wanted to make this video because as soon as I stumbled across it, I just thought that it was a fascinating tale that had been lost to history. And it's also a story that highlights the lengths that some people will go to just to get a large chicken and a couple of bottles of sparkling water. In all seriousness though, Marchen and the people she lived with were incredibly young and definitely made mistakes, but it seems like for the most part they went on to live normal, happy and successful lives. As for whether Marchen actually believed she was channeling Rudolph Valentino, we'll probably never know, but she was certainly not the last to claim to do so. I actually found a book by a man named Wayne Vincent Hatford called Valentino Speaks, The Wisdom of Rudolph Valentino, Cues and Views from the Other Side. According to the synopsis, Valentino speaks on 180 topics and said that we are always in need of a little fine-tuning. That's what this book promotes, if one wishes to avail oneself of it. The reviews were a little bit of a mixed bag, with some claiming that the wisdom within didn't sound anything like Valentino, while others said it made for great bathroom reading and was inspiring and hopeful. The man that wrote it, Wayne Hatford, sadly passed away last year. His friend wrote in a tribute that he had 3 main passions in life: channeling Valentino, collecting antiques, and anything Italian. I also found in my research a woman named Marion Isaacs, who is a self-described psychic and spiritual healer with more than 40 years of experience. In 2010, she met with Alex Monti Canawati, the film director and actor who would go on to star as Valentino himself in the movie Return to Babylon. He had actually been given Valentino's ruby ring by his family, and in a tape-recorded session, had actually given it to Marilyn so that she could communicate with his spirit.
Thank you. I'm very honored to have this on my hand. And he's very happy as well. It's not a channeling. I don't allow him to speak through my body, but it's more of what I would call an integration, because the abilities I have are very integrated with my personality. So, as a matter of fact, for the last 2.5 years, I've had an incredible journey with Rudolph Valentino through one of my clients. So I'm really honored that we've connected, right? And I know he's orchestrated it. There's no doubt, because he tends to, since he came into my life in a really unusual way through a client 2.5 years ago, he has magnificently orchestrated things.
Interestingly, if you go and watch that video on YouTube, you'll find a comment that claims that Marion Isaacs told one of her clients that he was Valentino's long-lost love child in another life, and told another woman that she was the love of Rudy's life. Now, I've got no idea how true those statements are, and as far as I'm concerned, they're just allegations. But it is funny that even now, 90 years after Marchen's scam, and almost 100 years since the death of Valentino himself, people are still claiming to channel him, and possibly still scamming people. I guess some things just never change. Thank you so much for watching the video. I know it's a bit of a shorter one with a bunch of different sidebar stories and kind of jumps around all over the place, and it's not even really a cult, but I thought it was interesting, and I thought that you guys would be interested in it as well. I've never seen anyone talking about this story before, so I thought, what the hell, let's make a video on it. And I honestly spend hours on newspapers.com, and I find these strange stories, strange people, and I'm always debating, will other people find this as interesting as I do? So if you want more of these kind of bizarre stories that aren't necessarily that long or that in depth, but are still, I think they're quite entertaining, then leave me a comment down below and maybe I'll do more of them. As always, thank you to all of my wonderful patrons for supporting the creation of these videos. If you want to become a patron, you can find the link in the description. We have a wonderful Discord community. There is some exclusive videos on the Patreon. There's some old videos from the vault. There's a couple of audio episodes on there and more. There's a bunch of things on there. And if you have any interesting stories that you haven't seen covered anywhere else, you can drop suggestions in the comments, or you can drop me an email, whichever way you prefer to communicate. And that is it. I will see you in the next video.